So I'm here with Chris Yule, Director of CTU Capabilities. He's about to lead a deepfake deep dive featuring experts from Mimecast and SentinelOne. But Chris, just before I let you head on in there to do your panel discussion, AI is the buzzword across all corners of technology. Can I get some insight into you as to how it impacts the cyber threat landscape particularly?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the question that we get asked most often these days. We've been using AI for a number of years, so although it's appeared with the emergence of Gen AI and ChatGPT and things like that, it's something that we've been experienced with for some time. But particularly in the last year, I think the question everybody has been asking is this going to represent the emergence of a new type of threat, or is it going to significantly expand the threats that we're facing? Right. So yeah, I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion without giving too much away of what we might talk about. I think the truth is that there hasn't been a significant development in the threat landscape. We're seeing threat actors use it, absolutely, but in similar ways that we're using it to just get more efficient, more effective in certain ways. But no dramatic developments that we're keeping an eye on, but definitely one we're going to keep looking at, and I think a lot to cover in 20 minutes, so it's going to be really interesting.
A lot to cover indeed, hint taken, so I will let you head on to the other studio and get settled in. And while he does that, and after he does some brief introductions, the panel are going to explore the realities and misconceptions surrounding that emerging technology like deepfakes, AI, business email compromise, and social engineering. They'll have lots of helpful case studies and personal anecdotes too. So over to them.
Okay, it's great to be here for our panel session. We're here to talk about AI, BEC, deepfakes, social engineering. So big topics, a lot to get through in 20, 25 minutes. So I guess just to give everyone a feel for who we all are. So Kiri and Aidan, thank you for joining me in the studio in London. Kiri, do you want to just give an overview of your role and where you've come from?
Yeah, sure. So I'm product manager for detection and efficacy at Mimecast. So I work with our researchers, our engineers, our data scientists to make sure that we're staying on top of the latest attacks, trends and techniques.
Fantastic. Aidan?
Aidan Sinnott, I'm a security researcher at SecureWorks Counter Threat Unit, specialising in cybercrime.
Great, thank you. Gregor, you're joining us remotely. Just do you want to tell us where in the world you are and a bit of background?
Hi, I'm calling in from Mountain View, California this morning. I'm Gregor Stewart, VP of Engineering for AI at SentinelOne, a cybersecurity platform provider.
Great, so definitely the perfect panel for this topic. Aidan, why don't we start with you? So I guess at the very top level, if we think about AI and we think about our job in terms of understanding the threat landscape, what uses of AI have we really seen in the threat landscape so far?
So we've seen threat actors looking at AI and investigating the uses of AI, much like most organisations. So how they can use it to simplify and accelerate and make efficiencies in their workflow and their processes. So for example, with phishing laws, we've seen generative AI being used to create more authentic and more targeted phishing laws in phishing campaigns. We've seen some content creation as well for websites. So AI being going out and scraping websites, creating new content and new websites that are then being used for fraud or for disinformation campaigns. Now we've seen some code development as well, very, very basic, usually poor quality malicious code, but what that does is lower the technical barrier for entry as well to cybercrime. So that's generally how we're seeing it, the improvement of their workflows and their processes. We're not seeing the new and novel TTPs that you might read about. It is much more about efficiency.
And that sounds very similar to what we're seeing as defenders. Like we're finding ways to make ourselves better with it, but we haven't yet found massively new uses for Gen AI and things like that. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. It mirrors how organisations are using it. It's just trying to find ways to take their existing techniques and just simplify it and accelerate it and improve their processes. And from their perspective as well, better ways to evade detection.
So I think if we start with phishing, I mean, I remember when we first started talking about generative AI and what changes would it make, the first thing that we thought of was phishing emails are going to get better, like all the usual stuff that we used to see of terrible spelling mistakes and formatting and things like that. ChatGPT will fix all that, and they can use that in the same way as we can to get better phishes. Kiri, I know you've been looking at this. What kinds of things have you been looking at, and what have you seen in terms of the evolution of phishes?
Yeah, so I think, like we heard how attackers could use this, and it's pretty easy to, generate a phishing email yourself using these tools. But we're processing billions of emails every day. And the question we had was, well, are we actually seeing this at all or in any volume? So we gave our data science team the task of building a model that could detect AI-generated emails, which they went away and did. They did a really good job of that. And when we ran it over our data, what we saw was really interesting. So there was this kind of point in time where you could see the percentage of human written emails starting to decrease and the percentage of LLM written emails starting to increase. And that point in time was quite significant. So it was November 2022, which was when ChatGPT was released. So we took that as quite strong evidence that yes, it is being used to create emails. And not just like marketing emails, but when we looked into it, we saw it was being used for BEC, for phishing, credential harvesting type emails, malware, spam, so the full spectrum of attacks. And yeah, in terms of kind of then looking at how do we detect these, so what we're doing is we have on the detection front, we're using this technology ourselves. So we have LLM-based detection models that can analyze specifically really payloadless emails. So they're able to understand like the context of the email, which is where these are powerful. And, bringing it back to AI-generated emails, they're actually not really that different from the human written emails. The aim is always the same. They've got to use language. Maybe they're slightly better written. But when you're using these for detection, it really doesn't matter whether it's written by an AI or a human.
And I mean, in terms of detection, are you using it actively for detections today?
We're not using it actively for detections today. We're evaluating whether it's actually a useful feature or not. In terms of, well, is something AI generated? We're using AI models for detection, but whether it's actually, beneficial for detection in terms of a feature, that's something that we're evaluating. And like I say, the models that we have are already effective at actually detecting them.
I find this really interesting because, like I said, the primary thing that we kind of came to and the message that we've been given is that this will make phishes harder to detect because it'll be much more natural language. Users won't have those kind of key things to look for in terms of bad phishes. But it sounds like I'm not going to say it's easy to detect it, but it's quite a good indicator that if there is something that's Gen AI, that's quite straightforward to detect if you have the right things in place, and that's another pattern that you can use as part of that.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is with some of these emails that have been classified as AI generated by our model, when we've taken a closer look at them, we're pretty confident that they are actually AI generated because there are some telltale signs like certain words used more frequently, and particular traits of certain models that would have been used to create them. But we are also seeing things like spelling mistakes and grammatical errors. So it's almost as if the attackers are putting those back in to try to evade systems that are using this as a feature of detection.
Wow, okay, that's interesting. So Gregor, if we turn to you and we start thinking about another type of AI, so deepfakes. Again, we've heard lots spoken about deepfakes and particularly for end users and the risks associated with that. What's your view on the evolution of deepfakes, and are they really forming a threat to kind of enterprises?
I think so. From fairly crude beginnings, you've seen a very rapid improvement in the ability to generate video, images, and voices, and there are legitimate reasons why I'd want to be able to generate voice and appearance. So if you think about Andy Serkis doing Gollum, right? That there's an obvious reason to generate a fake appearance there, right? For cinematic effect. But accessibility has been revolutionized by features like Apple's personal voice, and fully generated video conferencing has obvious benefits, such as if you're wearing a headset, right? Or if you have extremely low bandwidth. So there's a very strong underlying set of independent reasons why people want to get very good at doing this sort of thing. So voice-only deepfaking is already incredibly effective at cloning voices from tiny amounts of base material. A common capability you can download. The code to do it from GitHub, and you just need a few phrases essentially. And chat can make transcripts, can take transcripts from companies and generate culturally appropriate ways of speaking and so on very, very quickly in response to real conversational context. And so because phone calls and audio conferencing are very narrow bandwidth, typically, it makes it very easy to make it, in principle, undetectable. Video is still relatively easy to spot, but has also been improving even more quickly, especially for the kind of constrained environments that we find ourselves in at the moment, because people blur backgrounds and so on, and so it's actually quite an unnatural set of scenes. And so there's two modes in which this becomes very useful. The first one is internal, where we're talking, and you would find it very difficult to know whether this was generated or not, right? And a year from now, almost impossible. And external, where if I don't know a person, but I have but they're in my company or whatever, I might hear them saying something. I might see a video of them saying something and find it very difficult to determine whether that was correct, and that might radicalize me. I might be radicalized to do something internally, right, that I might not otherwise. So yes, a real threat.
As you were talking, Gregor, I found myself imagining that you're going to jump out the side of the studio and be like, actually, this is all a deep fake and I don't look anything like this. But
Right, exactly. That's the truth of it.
And Aidan, I mean, have we seen this affect our customers, or are people actually becoming victims? What types of attacks and things like that are we seeing deepfakes being used in?
So broadly speaking, the one that's probably the most high profile is CEO fraud. And that's where a victim will receive a video call, sometimes on WhatsApp or Teams, which will appear to come from their CEO. And it might be audio and video, or it might just be audio. And there usually be some kind of urgency around it. It'll be an acquisition, and this urgent transfer of funds need to be made into this bank account. And I think as well, the fact that it comes from the CEO, they generate this panic and this urgency. It kind of it stops the victim from looking too closely at any indicators, some of the things that Gregor mentioned, that may give away the fact that it was a deep fake, maybe any disconnect between the video and audio, or any kind of robotic cadence to it, or anything like that. And so we've seen some really high-profile cases where tens of millions of dollars have been transferred into attacker-controlled accounts by employees who've been speaking to an attacker who they think is their CEO. Sometimes, like I say, on audio, or sometimes on video. There was one example where an individual was on a Teams call with multiple individuals, and they were all deepfakes, and he ended up transferring about $20 million.
Wow.
So we're seeing increasing reports of that, but also on a smaller scale, we're seeing deepfakes being used for impersonation of celebrities or influencers on social media, and these are kind of more widespread campaigns where it's about investing in kind of an investment scam, so buying a crypto coin or investing in a scam business. And for a lot of people, I mean, in the security industry, when you're seeing these threats constantly, you forget that for a lot of people this is kind of James Bond stuff. The fact that there's a deep fake there who's going to try and con you out of money, but when they're scrolling through their social media feeds and they see a celebrity or an influencer that they trust and that they're used to seeing, who's telling them to invest in a crypto coin or something that's going to make them rich overnight, they'll do it. So we are seeing that as well, quite broadly.
And the interesting thing with the CEO fraud, I mean, we were already seeing a huge growth in that. And I mean, I'm sure we all have examples of where we've all received random WhatsApp messages, and some of them, they're all probably all going to end up being scams, but of different types. And we've seen the ones that make you go out and buy gift cards that you send to them and things like that. But hopefully he won't mind me outing him. But Don, who we saw earlier, who's the head of the counter threat unit, he got one last year, I think. It was someone pretending to be our CEO. And there was no deepfakes involved, but there was a convincing exchange of messages. There was a supposed lawyer who then made a phone call and sounded totally legit, and they had a website and things like that. So even without deepfakes, these things were becoming pretty convincing, and even people well versed in these things who are expecting them can still fall prey to them. But the deepfakes seem to be adding an extra layer where, as you say, people aren't expecting that. And I mean, I think we've only seen a handful of these cases where they've been successful, but the fear is that this could continue to grow and become more of a thing. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so. And as Gregor mentioned earlier, it's not a really advanced capability. It's not the reserved kind of nation states. It's open source. It's cheap or freely available to most people. It's not particularly difficult to use, and so it's much more widely available, much more likely to be used by threat actors.
And in terms of the natural question is, how do we detect this stuff? How do we train people to look out for it, and what mechanisms could we have in place to counter this stuff? So Kiri, thinking about it from your perspective, in terms of detecting and defending against these types of tactics, whether it's phishes or deepfakes, like how much of that is is the onus on the user to do that versus technical controls that can detect these fakes essentially?
Yeah, I think it's got to be a mixture of both really. Like we know when you're talking about these kinds of advanced attacks that are always changing, you're never going to have a solution that's like going to stop everything. It's never going to be 100% effective. So things are going to get through to the end user. So it's important that they, obviously have awareness of them. What's interesting is we did some research and we found that around 80% of incidents are caused by only 8% of your users. So your kind of risk in terms of your user base is not evenly distributed. So trying to identify which of your users are those risky ones and why are they risky, what can you do to help protect them, whether that's additional technical controls or more kind of targeted training based on the kind of threats that they might see, and these ones in particular. I think that is a critical step in trying to combat these attacks, as well as technical controls. And there are, deepfake detection is not a problem that's been solved. There are different ways you can try to do it, but it's still, it's still a big problem.
The stat that's always stuck with me, which I can't remember which report it was from years ago, but it was something like they tested like how many emails do you have to send into an organization to basically be statistically almost guaranteed to succeed in getting one user to click on it. I think it was like 14 emails. So as long as you sent 14 different emails into a company, 1% was almost certainly guaranteed to click on that. And that's terrifying, because it shows that it doesn't take that much effort to be successful. And yes, we always talk about user training, but we know that only has so much effect, because it just increases the 14 to 15 or 16 or something, which is not a huge deterrent against that. And so, Gregor, I know when we spoke before, you mentioned that you've been looking at kind of some of the ways that organizations are creating to kind of identify, particularly around the deep fakes, and detect and help users prevent these kinds of things. What kinds of things are you seeing organizations develop around this space?
I think detection still has some efficacy. So some of the more rudimentary techniques that have obvious tells in them, the kind of off-the-shelf techniques, are a little easier to detect. And so you can still do that. But what's problematic about that is the more that we deploy those detection technologies, the more rapidly the attackers will be able to evolve their approaches, because essentially we're providing them with an oracle for whether or not their approach is detectable. So almost we make it free for them to determine whether or not they have, they've been successful, and they can more rapidly improve. That's the part that's most expensive to check. However, I think there are other techniques like contact key verification, for example, which is a separate channel for verifying that the person you're speaking to or seem to be speaking to is that person. And this is essentially an exchange of keys, or a challenge technique. It's not in the channel, it's a separate channel, right? So watermarking and all that stuff, again, I think in principle that can be circumvented. This is more, you're asking someone in message to give a key that they have from some other application or embedded in the application. And if it checks out, then you're probably talking to the correct person. So that's probably going to be the dominant approach, right, to this, given that detection is likely to be, in principle, not going to work, right?
And it's one of those areas where when you ask that kind of question of like, how do you detect deepfakes, you expect some complex answer or these magnificent new technologies that are going to come out. But the answer always seems to be, as you say, it's quite rudimentary, and even at SecureWorks. So I think the solution that our security team have put in place is we have an intranet page that generates 2 code words every day. So that's somewhere that if you're talking to someone, you can ask them to go to that page and say, what's today's code words, to prove that they are at least, maybe not who they say they are, but it proves they're part of the organization and not just a random scammer. And like when they released that, we were kind of rolling our eyes going, that's so basic, but it works, doesn't it? It's the kind of thing that it's simple but effective, and we don't necessarily need to go beyond that if it works.
I mean, a lot of this sort of these approaches have been found to work in the intelligence community before. So it's not that we don't have them. But it's not a technical solution typically. You're right.
Yeah. And at Aidan, I think we're talking about AI, and we mentioned earlier that sometimes you don't need AI to be successful. And I guess there's that question of, is this being overhyped as a threat? And if we think of social engineering more generally, and move away from AI. So we've seen a lot of organizations be very successful without having to use AI. So there's been some chat today already about Scattered Spider, the ransomware group. They've been really successful with social engineering in the last year. Do you want to give some examples of the kinds of things that they've been successful with that isn't artificial but human?
Yeah, sure. So Scattered Spider is, we've probably covered earlier, is kind of an umbrella term for some subgroups and individuals who share a common set of TTPs and a similar demographic. And they are specialising in social engineering, mainly telcos, IT help desks. And the idea is they're either to SIM swap and drain crypto funds from individuals, or to get into organisations and deploy ransomware. And like I said, they're very successful doing this social engineering, and it tends to be human to human. So we've seen them have discussions, like most groups, about the use of AI and some of the tools they use. So whether that's for OSINT, kind of reconnaissance and research, and embedding some of the AI into their tools for that, or they quite commonly use call bots and chat bots to automate some of their calls as well. And they've had discussions in how they can integrate AI into those tools. But for the main attacks and the main social engineering on these help desks, we tend to see it's human versus human. And it's partly because, I suppose, with social engineering, it's about building a degree of trust and a rapport, being reactive to what the person on the help desk is telling them. And they're having great success with it in quite a few of the high-profile attacks we've seen recently. So at the moment, there's no real reason for them to change tack.
I think for me, there's two things there. So there's the help desk thing, so calling up the help desk, and the advice we've been given is make sure you've got robust processes in place, out of band. When people say they don't have access to IT, how do you identify that they are who you say they are? And sometimes you get lucky. I know we had one case where they only caught them because they phoned up and pretended to be the person that they were talking to, and just by pure coincidence they were like, I don't think you are that person, because that's me. But the SIM swapping stuff as well has been quite interesting. So the use of SMS, multi-factor authentication. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the guidance we've been giving?
Yeah, so we've seen these groups doing SIM swapping, calling up kind of telecom help desks, and what they essentially do is try and impersonate the owner of the phone and claim that they've lost their details, and get the password reset, take ownership of the phone number, and that gives them access to email, crypto passwords, things like that. And from there, they're able to drain the crypto accounts. And they've quite often targeted individuals where they know they've got a large amount of cryptocurrency in their holdings. So yeah, that's another area that's been really, really effective for them.
All right. So as I said, lots of very broad topics. I think we've come to the end of our time. We can bring Jules back in to close us out.
I'd be delighted. Thank you for scooching up and anticipating what I was going to say. Thank you so much, firstly, for a fantastic and fascinating conversation when you were telling us some of those numbers and the peril of what can happen for those who are victim of deepfakes and other emerging technologies. It really is amazing just to hear your insight. I wanted to ask, the title of this session is about truths and myths around this emerging technology. So I wanted to give you, I suppose, a two-pronged question, folks, and we can see who wants to jump in. Are there any areas that you haven't discussed so far where there is definite misconceptions from your perspective, or even overhype? Did anyone want to jump in on that first?
I think for me, the key message that hopefully we've got across is that, yes, we're all very aware of AI as an emerging technology. It's right that we're talking about it, but from the threat perspective, we're not seeing elaborate new threats coming from artificially intelligent things. We are seeing phishes becoming slightly better in some sense, but maybe also easier to detect. But there's no overarching super malware that's emerged from AI and things like that. Now, that's not to say we won't see that in the future, but right now our message is very much things are business as usual. AI is making them slightly more effective or more efficient in the same way as it's making many organizations like that. But it hasn't really been a game changer from a threat perspective yet.
Okay, thank you. And then I suppose conversely, is there anything, I suppose that there is truth to some of the hype or some of the concern in this space within emerging technologies, or is there anything that perhaps isn't receiving enough attention in your expert opinions?
I have an answer. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I think.
I have
Oh,
I have one. Sorry.
Yes, go.
Go on, Gregor.
So the idea that someone could fake someone's appearance and say radicalizing things, I think, is has been kind of missed. The idea that you would have someone who was trusted, by the public, and who would say something, and then people would go out and do things on the basis of that person saying things, right? I don't think we've had that kind of immediacy and connection, and so that is a real problem, especially since the effects are diverse. People end up, going to golf clubs and hiding in the bushes and trying to shoot people and so on, right? On the basis of these kinds of things. So that part, I think, is not overhyped, because we've seen the effects right at scale.
Thank you so much. Just one last question then before we wrap up. We're talking about, it seems, this sort of technology from a relatively nascent phase in the journey. Some of it is just about everyone figuring out what this might mean and trying to prepare as best as they can. So looking ahead, what are you keeping an eye on, or perhaps what are you anticipating this landscape might look like, say, in a year's time from now? Any ideas what you can expect?
I'm going to push that to Gregor as well.
I think we should act as if all of these technologies have reached their kind of final flowering, right? And to adopt technologies that would work in those circumstances. And as we said, things like contact key verification, for code words, and these kinds of approaches, right, should be adopted now, as if these technologies had reached their, their full flowering.
That sounds like a really sensible way to look at things. Thank you so much again. Great to have you all in. All right, another fantastic roundtable there. I hope it was helpful for you folks watching. And as we hit the halfway point in our TI Summit, we'd be remiss not to gain insights into the current state of ransomware as well. So stay with us for that up next.